Hey guys, I'm back with more JRPGs that I think aged really well. Some of these are very popular while others are kind of obscure. Now the same rule is back, only games that are at least 20 years old, and with that clarified, let's begin. Number 10, Dark Cloud 2. I don't feel the first Dark Cloud aged decently, so it's surprising to see how fun it is to play its sequel, also known as Dark Chronicle everywhere else. It got a digital re-release on PS4 some years ago with upscaled graphics, but the original PS2 version already looked fantastic. Perhaps we owe these timeless visuals to the cel-shaded graphics used by Level 5 on the game. I get the feeling games with this art style will probably never age. But what about the gameplay itself? Well, Dark Cloud 2 is hard to explain in a nutshell for a top 10 like this, since there's so much to do in the game. You don't just switch between two playable characters when you want and fight enemies in technical combat. The guy can summon a robot to fight the bigger enemies as well. But apart from battle, exploration is done through randomly generated areas, which feels refreshing every time. You gotta find keys and all to exit every single one of them, so you'll be doing that a lot. But it doesn't feel as repetitive as it sounds. I also think the boss fights are still quite creative and fun to enjoy even today. Like I said, there are other gameplay features here, like restoring villages around the world to advance with the story. While I always felt these hindered my progress a bit, it's pretty much just me. I believe the majority of you will enjoy this part, which by the way also involves recruiting NPCs, especially from your hometown. There's much more to explain, but I think I've said enough. The game aged well, and it's still fun to play nowadays. I can't rank it higher because controls during battle do feel slightly dated, just not enough to be called outdated. Number 9, Trials of Mana. For decades, this action RPG was a Japanese exclusive on the Super Famicom. Thankfully, it was released a few years ago for the first time in the West in Collection of Mana, though its original version has been fan-translated for a long time. No, you don't need to play any other Mana games to understand this one, they're all standalone, but here you can choose your protagonists, the three main characters you'll adventure with through the whole game. They control differently, of course, and each has their own plots, so plot and storyline connected to the main one. They aren't silent though, they have personalities and dialogue, but it's a game that focuses a little bit more on its gameplay with incredible pacing. For starters, you must have already noticed how detailed the graphics are, with very alluring art style in pixels. Their animations will probably never age. Exploration is rarely interrupted by loading screens or obnoxious puzzles, so it feels great to look around and fight. Combat isn't about button mashing, you have to preferably wait for the action bar to fill up to execute the best attack possible. It doesn't have the best controls, but they don't feel as dated as other action RPGs of this era. However, the reason why I'm not ranking this game higher is because I don't think its combat aged as marvelously as its visuals or pacing. Don't take me wrong, it's still fun to play, more polished than its younger brother Secret of Mana, but I still feel it's not gonna be everyone's favorite battle system nowadays. You know what other Mana game aged really well too? Legend of Mana. Technically speaking, there's only a few differences between this one and Trials of Mana. I mean, by looking at it, you can already tell it's not a polygonal interface with pre-rendered graphics. It definitely feels more like it was designed to be on the Super Nintendo or even the Sega Saturn, but it wasn't. Squaresoft knew very well what they were doing, despite some criticism out there, precisely for not looking like a next-generation video game. Well, joke's on them, as that's exactly the reason why it aged so well in so many areas. Just like in Trials of Mana, everything looks stunning, detailed, and carefully drawn. In fact, it's one of the most beautiful JRPGs in history in my opinion. Sprite animations are simply ageless, and they shine in all those colorful backgrounds. Controls aren't the best, but they are an improvement over Trials and Secret of Mana. You'll barely have any issues navigating through dungeons or towns. Combat is no longer restricted by the percentage action bar from before, which I do believe is an improvement. It's still somewhat sluggish and technical, but that's how it was designed to be. What matters is that it still feels great attacking enemies and defeating bosses. Legend of Mana got a remaster not long ago on modern systems, but you honestly can't go wrong with the original. Number 7. Paper Mario. It's very easy to explain why this game aged really well. Unlike many Nintendo 64 games that are in their blurry, foggy and ugly looking 3D, Paper Mario is in 2.5D. The best of it all is that the characters themselves, they're all supposed to be made out of paper, making them completely in 2D regardless of their environment. Making the game this way was a great idea from Intelligent Systems, developers of Fire Emblem. I really do believe that if many other 64 games would have been made like this, their age wouldn't show so badly nowadays. I understand everyone was anxious to jump straight from 2D to 3D back then, but the initial input for programming and modeling wasn't so great. There's a lot of 3D games that still look good though, but a classic like Paper Mario puts them all to shame with simple 2.5D graphics, highly detailed visuals, and a very colorful design. Well, that's a Mario game for ya. And no, controls don't feel weird at all. The navigation interface, including menus, still feel natural and easy to get used to. No wonder why this is still one of the best games in the series. Number 6. Crusader of Centy. If you think some Zelda games like A Link to the Past aged well, obviously Crusader of Centy did so too. It was heavily inspired by the aforementioned title after all, just adding way more RPG elements. So you go around towns, talk to people, level up, recruit monsters to fight by your side, and then some more. I think it's an overlooked gem that more and more people are starting to appreciate, especially now since it was finally re-released after so many years on the Sega Genesis Mini 2. Don't think I don't know how freaking expensive the physical copy goes for nowadays, but I'll never understand why Sega never brought it to any of its Ultimate collections on previous consoles. Anyway, everything controls great here, from moving around to swinging your sword to fighting enemies. A few areas can be still somewhat cryptic, but it shouldn't take you long to figure them out. The flow of things just goes on naturally, and it is accompanied by colorful graphics and lovely pixel art. Pretty sure it looks even better with modern emulation like pretty much all other games in this video. Check this one out if you can, it's a friendly approach for all ages and with solid pacing. Number 5. Treasure of the Rudras. I very rarely include Japanese-only RPGs in my top 10s, but I wanted to make an exception for this one. It's one of the very few Squaresoft titles that never made it overseas for no reason. It's upsetting as this is one really good-looking game that, like many 16-bit releases, aged fantastically. I mean, just look at the pixel art, man. Here you can choose between 3 initial protagonists, but eventually you'll have to complete each storyline to unlock the 4th main character and the final battles. The premise is really dark and interesting about a world that gets reset every 4,000 years. Every single living being is wiped out and replaced by a god called Rudra. 15 years before the next reset is where our story begins. As you can see, this is a turn-based RPG where controls and menus are simple but fun. One of the most memorable mechanics of this game is the magic system. You can randomly create spells with whatever name you give them. Of course, making them actually useful depends on the 8 elements, the mantra, the core element, etc. You need to figure these things out during your adventure to come up with some badass spells. I think the game suffers from a high encounter rate, but there are far worse examples out there like the first 2 Breath of Fire games. Other than that, this game aged very well, so I hope we can get an official English release one day. Square Enix remade Live Alive recently, so why not this one? Number 4. Kartia, the Word of Fate. Kartia is a PS1 exclusive developed by Atlus with character design by Yoshitaka Amano. It's a strategy RPG that I never thought would age this well. It never had the prettiest graphics or sprites, but unlike other beauties of its time, it aged much better. The loading times between scenes and battles are minimal, unlike other strategy RPGs with bigger budgets like Vandal Hearts for example. The interface isn't the quickest or the most appealing, but controls and menus work just fine and barely feel clunky. My only complaint is that the spell names are all in Japanese, but the descriptions are in English, so as long as you understand what you're using, it's not a problem whatsoever. One thing to notice also is that the balance in this game is pretty good. It's not a difficult game to understand or get into, which is the reason why I often recommend it for beginners. In case you're wondering what's it about, it's a strategy RPG like you've been seeing so far. You choose between Toxa and Lacrima, both stories interconnected and required to complete the game. Don't worry, because one thing that also aged well was the fact that both storylines have different maps and different party members. The game has a terrific story and strong character development. This is definitely recommended, but despite having aged very decently, I hope we get some kind of port one day, since it's not even digitally anywhere. Come on, Atlus, this game's begging for a re-release of any kind. Number 3, Growlanser III, The Dual Darkness. To be honest, I can't decide if Growlanser II, The Sense of Justice, aged just as well. I think a menu-based exploration with random encounters is a bit dated. Not to say the animations during battle look great, but feel slightly dated. I think it aged alright, but the Dual Darkness aged better, simple as that. For starters, it does not look like a PlayStation 2 game with polygons and 3D models in better resolution as opposed to PS1 graphics. Sprites are used for the characters and their animations look gorgeous. It honestly feels like an early PS1 game in the vein of RPGs like Wild Arms or Breath of Fire 3. Something really important though is the controls during exploration and combat, since the majority of the gameplay revolves around sandbox missions where you can direct your characters anywhere. There's no loading times between battle. There are random encounters in the overworld, but are rare and usually end up quickly. This game shines in its mission design, although I'd like to say that later entries felt more creative. Still, none of the mechanics feel dated, spells can be easily skipped, animations don't look or feel weird, and overall it has a nicely programmed interface. Sadly, the English voice acting by Working Designs can make anyone cringe. It's decent for the most part, but they could have chosen better actors for some characters like Monica, for example. Wish we could have had the Japanese audio instead. Nevertheless, it's a minor complaint. There are worse dubs out there from this era. This is still an excellent game to play nowadays. Number 2, Tales of Eternia. Unlike its older brothers Fantasia and Destiny, Eternia aged surprisingly well. I always thought at least the exploration graphics in 3D with steel backgrounds would look ugly after a couple of decades, but they still seem absolutely beautiful. The sprites, for instance, are amongst the best in the PS1. There's barely anything polygonal in this game, which is why it aged great. I wish I could say the same about Star Ocean 2, which didn't age badly at all, but not so great either, especially in terms of visuals or controls during exploration. I think Eternia did a great job in making the player walk freely in all directions without feeling janky. Plus, the loading times between random encounters are fairly quick. One thing Star Ocean 2 aged well in was its combat, just like in Eternia. I always felt that visually speaking it wasn't the biggest improvement over its predecessors, but in terms of controls, holy crap, the difference is abysmal. Characters control and fight really well here. It's not the best Tales in combat in 2D, but damn is it fun. This game is repetitive and can be a bit of a button masher. You'll get tired after an hour of fighting, but that's okay. What didn't age well, unfortunately, just like in Growlanser 3, is the voice acting. And they didn't even fix this for the PSP release, which also aged pretty well, by the way. This is my one and only gripe. If this action RPG ever gets some modern treatment, I hope they at least hire decent actors, cause honestly the ones here make the cast in Growlanser 3 sound like real professionals. Number 1, Shining Force 1 and 2. Actually, I'd like to throw here as well the Sega CD version of Shining Force Gaiden 1 and 2, pretty much the best one to play, now included also in the damn Sega Genesis Mini 2. These 4 games aged marvelously. They're just as fun as they were back in the day, and for a few number of reasons. 16-bit graphics are often a sight to behold today. For some reason they looked fantastic back in the day, and they're still enjoyable to look at. But I think the one thing that matters a lot is how the gameplay feels in your controller, how it feels to control your character, be it in an action, turn-based or strategy RPG. The latter genre usually ages nicely, not always, but most of the time because it's based on overview maps with grid-based navigation. However, Shining Force 1 and 2 include a traditional style of gameplay where you travel from town to town, and even exploring there feels great, not clunky, not tedious. Sometimes cameras can be quite a chore in later JRPGs of the mid to late 90s, but Shining Force doesn't even need that. It only moves in 4 directions, and that's all you need for a game of its kind. The first 2 games have been included in many Sega collections for different consoles. Perhaps the best looking versions are the ones on the PS4 release with upscaled graphics. But man, loading times even in the original Sega Genesis were almost non-existent, which makes the pacing and the flow feel awesome. So apart from its nice pixel art and its well-designed combat, I think these games aged very well and still hold up pretty good nowadays. Those are my picks for today's video, 10 JRPGs that aged just fine. I have some honorable mentions like Lost Kingdoms on the GameCube and Tactics Ogre on the Game Boy Advance, in case you're interested. Check those out too if you can and decide for yourself if they aged well. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!